Arizona Territory, 1878. The desert lay vast and unforgiving under the bright moon, stretching to the horizon like a sea of silver sand. The frontier was a place that could swallow a soul whole, leaving nothing but bones and regret, and no one understood this better than Roy Kincaid. At 26, he had already weathered more heartbreak and hardship than most men twice his age, and it had left him with one unshakable conviction. The only way to survive the frontier was to need no one and to be needed by no one. Roy adjusted his Stetson against the night chill, his lean frame silhouetted against the campfire's dying embers. His face, handsome despite the faint scar along his jawline, remained stoic as he listened for any sound beyond the crackling flames. His hands, calloused from years of roping cattle and breaking horses, rested near the Colt revolver at his hip, a habit born of necessity rather than paranoia. 6 years riding for the Circle M Ranch had taught him that vigilance was as essential as water in this unforgiving land. A man who lets his guard down is a man who gets buried, his father had told him before a band of Comancheros had cut him down outside their small homestead when Roy was just 15. Those words and the violent loss that followed had shaped the young cowboy into someone who trusted the desert more than he trusted people. The desert, at least, was honest in its cruelty. The cattle drive to Tucson could wait until dawn. Tonight he needed rest, though sleep rarely came easy. Every time he closed his eyes, the memories found him. His father's broken body, his mother's wasting illness the following winter, and the sister he had failed to protect from the harsh realities of a land where law was still more aspiration than fact. These ghosts were his only constant companions, and he had made his peace with that. Or so he told himself each night as he stared into the vast emptiness of the Arizona sky. Attachment is just another word for weakness, Roy muttered to the fire as he poked at it with a stick, and weakness gets you killed out here. The sudden crack of a branch snapping in the darkness brought him instantly to his feet, gun drawn. He moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger, positioning himself between the fire and whatever approached from the shadows. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Show yourself slow and easy, or I start shooting." The silence stretched for several heartbeats before a voice, tremulous but determined, responded from the darkness. "Please, I mean no harm. I'm lost and I saw your fire." A woman stepped cautiously into the circle of light, her hands raised to show she carried no weapon. Roy's breath caught despite himself. She was young, perhaps 21 or 22, with hair the color of wheat in summer, now disheveled and partially escaping from what had once been an elegant updo. Her dress, once fine but now torn and dusty, suggested means and education, things wildly out of place in this desolate stretch of desert. Despite the dirt smudging her face, there was no disguising her beauty, high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes the clear blue of a winter sky. But it was the fear and exhaustion in those eyes that kept Roy's gun trained on her, even as something long dormant stirred within him. "Ma'am," he acknowledged, not lowering his weapon, "you're a long way from anywhere safe. What brings a lady like yourself out here alone?" She swayed slightly, and Roy noticed the dried blood on her sleeve and the way she favored her right leg. Whatever her story, it wasn't a simple tale of getting lost on an evening stroll. "My name is Sarah Everett," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I was traveling by stagecoach to Tucson when we were attacked. Bandits." She paused, swallowing hard. "They killed the driver and the guard. I ran when they were distracted with the strongbox. I've been walking for hours, hoping to find someone." Roy's instincts warred within him. Help meant responsibility. Responsibility meant risk. Risk meant potential loss. The equation was simple, and he had sworn after burying his family never to put himself in that position again. And yet, leaving her to the mercy of the desert or the bandits who might still be tracking her was not something he could bring himself to do. "Sit down before you fall down," he said gruffly, finally lowering his gun but not holstering it. "I've got water and some beans left from supper." Relief washed over her face as she limped forward and sank gratefully beside the fire. Roy handed her his canteen, watching as she drank deeply, the firelight playing across features too refined for the harsh country around them. "Thank you," she said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "I thought I might die out there." "You still might," Roy replied bluntly. "Those bandits could be looking for you and we're exposed here. Come morning, I'll take you as far as Tucson. After that, you're on your own." Sarah's eyes flashed with a spark of defiance that surprised him. "I understand, I don't expect charity, Mr. Kincaid, Roy Kincaid. Mr. Kincaid, I assure you, I am not in the habit of being a burden. Once in Tucson, I can make arrangements." She straightened her shoulders, dignity reasserting itself despite her bedraggled appearance. Something about her composure in the face of such adversity struck Roy. Most people would be hysterical after what she had endured, yet here she sat, bloodied but unbowed. It reminded him uncomfortably of his mother, another woman who had faced frontier hardship with quiet strength until that strength had finally failed her. "Let me see that arm," he said, moving closer and gesturing to the bloodstain on her sleeve. "If it needs tending, better to do it now." Sarah hesitated before extending her arm. "It's not deep, I think, just a graze." Roy gently rolled up her sleeve, revealing a nasty gash that, while not life-threatening, needed cleaning. "Bullet?" he asked, reaching for his saddlebag to retrieve a small flask of whiskey and a relatively clean bandana. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the wound as if seeing it for the first time. "I didn't realize I'd been hit until I was already running." "Fear does that," Roy said, pouring whiskey over the wound without warning. Sarah gasped but didn't cry out, impressing him further. "Dulls the pain until you're safe enough to feel it." As he wrapped the bandana around her arm, their eyes met, and for a moment the barriers Roy had so carefully constructed seemed to waver. There was something in Sarah's gaze, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred resilience that unsettled him deeply. He pulled away abruptly, returning to his side of the fire. "Try to get some sleep, Miss Everett. Dawn comes early, and we've got ground to cover." She nodded, settling herself as comfortably as possible on the hard ground, using her torn shawl as a pillow. "Mr. Kincaid," she said softly as she closed her eyes, "thank you for not leaving me out there." Roy didn't respond, but as he kept watch through the night, his eyes returned again and again to her sleeping form. The unexpected arrival of Sarah Everett had introduced a complication to his carefully ordered existence, and complications, in Roy's experience, invariably led to pain. Yet as the night deepened, he found himself listening not just for the approach of danger but for the soft rhythm of her breathing, as if it were somehow essential to the night's quiet harmony. Dawn broke with the merciless clarity unique to the desert, painting the landscape in hues of gold and rose that belied its deadly nature. Roy had already packed his meager camp and saddled his horse by the time Sarah stirred, her eyes opening with momentary confusion before memory flooded back. "We need to move," Roy said without preamble, offering her the last of his jerky. "If those bandits are still looking for you, they'll be easier to spot in daylight, but that works both ways." Sarah accepted the food, wincing as she rose to her feet. The night on the hard ground had done her injuries no favors. "How far to Tucson?" "A day's ride if we push hard, longer if we're careful, which we should be." He eyed her torn dress dubiously. "Riding's going to be difficult in that getup." Sarah glanced down at her ruined attire. "I'm afraid it's all I have. The rest of my belongings were on the stagecoach." Roy hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a spare shirt. "Put this on over your dress. It'll give you some protection from the sun, at least." She accepted the offering with a grateful nod, turning away slightly as she donned the oversized garment. Roy busied himself checking his rifle, deliberately avoiding watching her. When she was done, he offered her a hand up onto his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Rusty. "I'll walk and lead him," Roy explained, adjusting the stirrups for her smaller frame. "Easier to spot trouble that way." Sarah settled into the saddle, arranging her skirts as modestly as possible. "You're very kind, Mr. Kincaid." "It's not kindness, Miss Everett, it's practicality. A dead woman would attract buzzards, and buzzards attract attention I don't need." Despite his harsh words, Sarah smiled slightly. "Then I shall endeavor not to die and inconvenience you with buzzards." The unexpected humor caught Roy off guard, and he found himself fighting a smile of his own. "See that you don't," he replied, turning to lead the horse into the brightening day. They traveled in silence for the first hour, Roy's eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit or other threats. The desert, beautiful in its stark simplicity, offered little shelter but many dangers. Heat would soon become their most immediate concern. "May I ask what brings you to this part of the territory?" Sarah eventually inquired, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone educated back east. Roy considered ignoring the question but found himself answering anyway. "Cattle Drive. I work for the Circle M ranch north of here, taking a small herd to sell in Tucson." "Alone?" "The others went ahead with most of the herd. I stayed back for some strays, was planning to catch up today." Sarah absorbed this information, her eyes taking in the empty landscape around them. "You must be very good at your job to be trusted with such responsibility." Roy shrugged, uncomfortable with what sounded like praise. "It's just work." "It's more than that," she disagreed. "It's a life, one that requires courage and skill." He glanced back at her, surprised by her perception. "And what brings a lady like you out to the Arizona territory?" "Not exactly a place for fine dresses and afternoon tea." A shadow crossed her face and she looked away. "I was to be married. My fiancé established a law practice in Tucson last year. I was joining him to prepare for the wedding." Roy noted her use of was rather than am, but didn't press. Whatever had happened between Sarah and her intended was none of his business. Still, he couldn't help feeling a twinge of curiosity and something else he refused to name. "Tucson's growing fast," he commented. "Good place for a lawyer, I suppose." "So James wrote," Sarah replied, her fingers twisting the fabric of her borrowed shirt. Though his letters became less frequent in recent months. The implication hung in the air between them, but before Roy could respond, not that he knew what to say, he spotted a plume of dust on the horizon. He halted immediately, reaching for Rusty's bridle. "Get down," he ordered, helping Sarah from the saddle. "Quick, behind those rocks." Without questioning, she followed his lead, crouching behind the meager shelter of a rocky outcropping as Roy drew his rifle and lay flat on his stomach at the edge, peering through his scope. "Riders," he murmured, "3 of them moving fast, could be your bandits, could be someone else. Either way, better they don't see us." Sarah's breath came quicker, her shoulder pressed against his as they waited in tense silence. The riders drew closer, their features becoming distinguishable through Roy's scope, rough-looking men, heavily armed, with the unmistakable air of those who lived outside the law. "It's them," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "The one in front with the red bandana, he was their leader." Roy's finger rested lightly on the trigger, ready if needed. The bandits were following what appeared to be a trail, her trail, he realized. They had tracked her from the stagecoach. "Stay absolutely still," he breathed as the men drew close enough that they could hear the pounding of hooves and the jingle of spurs. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the bandits would ride right past their hiding place. Then abruptly the leader raised his hand, signaling a halt. Roy tensed, his body coiled like a spring. "Trail goes cold here," one of the men called, dismounting to examine the ground. "Looks like she might have been picked up." "Damn it all," the leader snarled, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "The marshal in Tucson will have a posse out once that stage is overdue. We need to find her before she talks." "Maybe the coyotes got her," another suggested. "Saved us the trouble." The leader spat on the ground. "We don't know that, and Mr. Palmer was very clear, no witnesses." At the mention of the name, Roy felt Sarah stiffen beside him. Her hand gripped his arm with surprising strength, her nails digging through his shirt into his skin. "We keep looking," the leader decided. Spread out, she couldn't have gotten far on foot. As the men separated, Roy realized one was heading directly toward their hiding place. In seconds, they would be discovered. Making a split-second decision, he turned to Sarah. "When I start shooting, run to the horse and be ready to ride," he whispered. "Don't wait for me, head southwest, you'll hit the Tucson road by midday." Sarah's eyes widened. "I won't leave you." "This isn't a discussion," Roy hissed, but before he could say more, the approaching bandit called out, "Hey, Jeb, I think I found something." Roy didn't hesitate. Rising to one knee, he fired, catching the man square in the chest. The bandit crumpled without a sound. The other 2 reacted instantly, diving for cover and returning fire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them. "Go," Roy shouted, providing covering fire as Sarah dashed for Rusty. The horse, well-trained despite the gunfire, stood his ground as she scrambled into the saddle. Roy backed toward her, still firing, then made a desperate leap onto the horse behind her. "Ride," he commanded, grabbing the reins and digging his heels into Rusty's flanks. The horse launched forward, carrying them away from the outcropping as bullets kicked up dust at their heels. They rode hard for several miles, the sound of pursuit gradually fading behind them. Only when Roy was certain they had lost the bandits did he slow Rusty to a walk, the horse's sides heaving with exertion. "We can't stop for long," he said, his voice grim. "They'll pick up our trail eventually." Sarah nodded, her back rigid against his chest. They had ridden so hard that propriety had been forgotten, her body pressed against his arms around her to hold the reins. Now in the relative calm, both became acutely aware of their proximity. "That name they mentioned," Roy said, deliberately focusing on the more pressing concern. "Palmer, you recognized it." Sarah was silent for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. "James Palmer, my fiancé." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. "Your fiancé hired bandits to attack your stagecoach." She turned her head slightly, her profile visible to him now. A single tear tracked down her dust-streaked cheek. "I received a letter, you see, from a woman in Tucson. She claimed to be carrying James's child, that they had been together for months. I wrote to him demanding an explanation. And instead of explaining, he decided to make sure you never reached Tucson at all," Roy finished, disgust evident in his tone. "I refused to believe it at first," Sarah continued, her voice strengthening. "Even when the stagecoach was attacked, I thought it was just bad luck, but then I heard one of them say my name specifically. They were looking for me," she drew a shuddering breath. "The man I loved wants me dead." The raw pain in her voice struck Roy like a physical blow. He had spent years armoring himself against such emotions, convincing himself that attachments only led to suffering. Sarah's experience seemed to confirm his worldview, and yet he found himself wanting to comfort her, to protect her from further harm. "We need to keep moving," he said instead, guiding Rusty onto a rocky patch where their tracks would be harder to follow. "And we need a new plan. Tucson isn't safe for you now." "Where can I go?" Sarah asked, the momentary despair in her voice quickly replaced by determination. "No, I won't run. If James sent these men to kill me, he needs to answer for it." Roy shook his head. "A lawyer with enough money to hire killers, he'll have connections with local law. Your word against his won't count for much without proof." "Then we'll find proof," Sarah insisted, twisting in the saddle to look directly at him. Their faces were inches apart, her eyes bright with conviction. "Will you help me, Mr. Kincaid? I know I have no right to ask, but I have no one else." Roy knew the sensible answer, the one that aligned with everything he believed about survival on the frontier. Get her to safety, perhaps the mission at San Xavier del Bac, and then ride away. Continue his solitary existence, unburdened by someone else's troubles. It was the prudent choice, the safe choice. Yet looking into Sarah's eyes, he found himself unable to give that answer. "We'll need supplies," he said instead. "There's a trading post about 3 hours west of here. We can rest there, figure out our next move." The smile that illuminated her face was like sunrise breaking over the desert, sudden, brilliant, and transformative. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried the weight of a much greater sentiment. Roy urged Rusty forward, acutely aware of Sarah's warmth against him and the foreign feeling unfurling in his chest, something he had thought long dead, awakening like desert flowers after rain. The trading post was little more than a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a well, but it represented civilization after the lonely expanse of desert. Roy approached cautiously, ever mindful that the bandits could have sent word ahead. "Wait here," he instructed Sarah, helping her dismount in a small copse of mesquite trees a short distance from the post. "I'll make sure it's safe." She nodded, taking Rusty's reins. "Be careful." Roy walked the remaining distance, his hand never far from his gun. The trading post appeared quiet, a few horses hitched outside, an old dog sleeping in the shade, a woman hanging laundry behind the main building. Nothing to suggest danger, but Roy had survived this long by being cautious. The interior of the trading post was cool and dim after the bright sunlight, A bearded man looked up from behind the counter, setting aside the harness he had been mending. "Afternoon," the shopkeeper greeted him. "What can I do for you?" Roy made a show of examining the goods on the shelves. "Need some supplies heading west." "Got a mighty fine selection, considering we're out in the middle of nowhere," the man replied proudly. "Even got some canned peaches in last week." As they spoke, Roy casually surveyed the other occupants of the store, an elderly couple examining bolts of fabric, and a solitary man in the corner nursing a drink, his back to the wall. The latter drew Roy's attention. Something about his posture spoke of vigilance rather than relaxation. "Any trouble in these parts lately?" Roy asked casually. "Heard there might have been a stagecoach holdup." The shopkeeper's expression darkened. "Bad business that. Word came through this morning. Driver and guard killed, all the passengers too, they think. Marshals forming a posse in Tucson." Roy kept his face carefully neutral. "All the passengers. That's the story. Though," the man lowered his voice, leaning closer. "Jenkins, he rides circuit between here and Tucson. He said they only found 4 bodies at the scene. Stage manifest showed 5 passengers. One might have gotten away," he straightened, shaking his head, "or the coyotes got to them before Jenkins passed by." "Terrible thing," Roy commented, selecting a few essential items: coffee, beans, ammunition, and a small pot. "I'll take these and some of those peaches you mentioned." As the shopkeeper totaled his purchases, Roy noticed the man in the corner stand and move toward the door, his gaze lingering on Roy longer than was comfortable. Something about his manner raised Roy's hackles, but he kept his expression impassive as he paid and gathered his supplies. "Much obliged," he said, tipping his hat to the shopkeeper before stepping back into the harsh sunlight. Roy made his way back to Sarah with measured steps, fighting the urge to look over his shoulder. When he reached the mesquite grove, he found her waiting anxiously, Rusty saddled and ready to go. "We need to leave," he said without preamble. "There was a man in there I didn't like the look of. Could be nothing, but I don't want to take chances." Sarah nodded, helping him secure the supplies. "Did you learn anything?" "They think all the stage passengers were killed." "That might work in our favor. If Palmer believes you're dead, he might let his guard down." Roy paused, considering their options. "But we still need proof of his involvement if we're going to bring him to justice." "The bandits," Sarah suggested as they mounted Rusty. "If we could capture one, force him to confess." Roy shook his head. "Too dangerous, and a confession under duress won't hold up." He guided Rusty away from the trading post, taking a trail that led northwest rather than toward Tucson. "We need to find evidence, letters, payments, something that connects Palmer to the attack." "His office," Sarah said suddenly. "James keeps meticulous records. If he paid these men, there will be a record somewhere in his office or home." "Breaking into a lawyer's office in the middle of Tucson isn't exactly discreet," Roy pointed out. "No, but I might have another way in." A faint smile curved Sarah's lips. "James's clerk Edward was always sweet on me, and unlike his employer, I believe he's an honest man. He might help us if I can speak to him privately." Roy considered this. "It's risky, but it might be our best option. We need to get you into Tucson without being seen." He frowned, thinking. "There's a mission about 10 miles outside town, San Xavier del Bac. We'll go there first. The sisters might be able to help." As they rode, Roy became increasingly conscious of the man from the trading post. Something about his demeanor had suggested a hunter rather than merely a traveler, and if word of the stagecoach attack had reached the trading post, who knew what other details had been shared, like a description of a missing passenger. His instincts proved correct when an hour later he spotted dust on the horizon behind them, riders moving fast and with purpose. "We've got company," he told Sarah grimly, urging Rusty off the trail and into a wash where their tracks would be harder to follow. "Hold tight." They pushed through dense brush, branches whipping at their faces and tearing at their clothing. Rusty, burdened with 2 riders, was tiring, but the gelding was tough and responded gamely to Roy's commands. The sound of pursuit grew closer despite their efforts. Roy made a snap decision, guiding Rusty toward a steep-sided arroyo he remembered from previous journeys. If they could reach it before their pursuers caught up, they might have a chance. "There," he pointed as the arroyo came into view. "We'll make our stand there, better defensive position." They had barely reached the relative shelter of the arroyo when the first shots rang out. Roy helped Sarah dismount and find cover behind a large boulder, then positioned himself with his rifle, sighting down the barrel as their pursuers appeared at the mouth of the arroyo. 3 riders, the 2 surviving bandits from earlier and, as he had feared, the man from the trading post. They had split up to circle the arroyo, using the rocky terrain for cover. "Stay down," Roy instructed Sarah, firing a warning shot that kicked up dirt near the closest rider. "I've got 6 shots in the rifle, 12 in the revolver, make them count." What followed was a tense exchange of gunfire that echoed off the arroyo walls. Roy was a good shot, but so were their attackers, and he was outnumbered. A bullet grazed his arm and he felt the hot sting of it but kept firing, managing to wound one of the bandits. "We just want the girl, Cowboy," the leader shouted from behind a rock. "You hand her over, you can ride away. No need for you to die today." "That's mighty generous," Roy called back sarcastically, "but I think I'll pass." "Your funeral," came the reply, followed by another volley of shots. Sarah crouched beside Roy, loading his revolver with steady hands as he continued firing the rifle. "We're trapped," she whispered. "They're going to flank us soon." Roy knew she was right. Their position, while defensible from the front, was vulnerable from the sides. Already, one of the men was working his way around to their left, using the arroyo wall for cover. "When I say run, head deeper into the arroyo," Roy told her. "There's a split about 50 yards in, take the right fork. I'll hold them here as long as I can, then follow." Sarah's eyes widened. "No, they'll kill you." "Better chance this way," Roy insisted. "I'll keep them pinned down. You find a hiding spot. If I don't come, the mission is due west, you'll see the white towers." Before she could protest further, Roy rose and unleashed a barrage of fire, forcing their attackers to duck for cover. "Run," he shouted, continuing to fire as Sarah reluctantly obeyed, disappearing deeper into the arroyo. Roy maintained his position, conserving ammunition but keeping up enough fire to prevent the men from advancing. Minutes stretched like hours as he waited for Sarah to get clear. Finally, sensing she'd had enough time, he prepared to fall back. That was when he heard her scream. Without hesitation, Roy abandoned his position, running toward the sound. He rounded the bend in the arroyo to find the man from the trading post holding Sarah at gunpoint, his arm around her throat. "Drop the gun, Cowboy," the man ordered, "or the lady dies right here." Roy froze, his rifle half raised. The man had circled around, anticipating their move. Sarah's eyes met Roy's, a mixture of fear and defiance in their blue depths. "Don't do it," she managed, her voice strained against the pressure on her throat. "He'll kill us both anyway." "Shut up," the man growled, pressing the gun harder against her temple. "Last chance, Cowboy, gun down now." Time seemed to slow as Roy weighed his options. The distance was too great for a reliable shot, especially with Sarah in the man's grasp. If he surrendered, they would both die. If he fired and missed, Sarah would die instantly. In that crystallized moment of decision, Roy realized something that shook him to his core. The thought of Sarah's death terrified him more than his own. This woman, whom he had known for less than a day, had somehow breached the walls he had built around his heart. The revelation came with a clarity that was almost blinding. His father's words echoed in his mind. "A man who lets his guard down is a man who gets buried." But perhaps his father had been wrong. Perhaps there were things worth risking everything for. Roy lowered his rifle slowly to the ground. "Smart choice," the man said with a cruel smile. "Now we're going to wait here for my associates, and then we'll all have a little talk about why Mr. Palmer is so interested in making sure this lady never reaches Tucson." As he spoke, his grip on Sarah loosened slightly, just enough. With a strength born of desperation, she drove her elbow hard into his stomach and twisted away. The man grunted in pain but kept his hold on her arm, raising his gun. Roy didn't hesitate. He drew his revolver in one fluid motion and fired, hitting the man squarely in the chest. The impact threw him backward, his shot going wild. He crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock as life drained from them. Sarah stood trembling, her gaze fixed on the fallen man. Roy moved quickly to her side, pulling her away from the body. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his hands gentle on her shoulders as he examined her for injuries. She shook her head, still staring at the dead man. "You saved my life again," her voice was barely above a whisper. "You dropped your gun for me. Why would you do that?" Roy couldn't answer, the truth too raw, too new to be spoken aloud. Instead, he said, "We need to move. The others will have heard the shot." They retrieved Rusty, who had wandered a short distance up the arroyo, and mounted quickly. Roy guided them through the narrow passage, emerging on the other side and spurring the tired horse into a gallop across the open desert toward the distant white towers of the mission. San Xavier del Bac rose from the desert like a mirage, its white walls and ornate facade gleaming in the late afternoon sun. By the time they reached it, both they and Rusty were exhausted, covered in dust and, in Roy's case, blood. The sisters took them in without question, providing food, water, and medical attention. Roy's wound was minor, requiring only cleaning and bandaging. Sarah, though physically unhurt apart from the earlier bullet graze, was showing signs of shock, her hands trembling as a kindly nun wrapped her in a blanket and pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands. "You are safe here," the elderly sister assured them both. "Rest now, we can speak more in the morning." In the sparse but clean room provided for him, Roy sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his mind replaying the events of the day. The moment when he had lowered his rifle kept returning to him, that instant of absolute clarity when he had known he would rather die than see Sarah harmed. It contradicted everything he had believed about survival, about keeping himself separate and unattached. A soft knock at his door roused him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Sarah standing there, her hair freshly combed, wearing a simple dress borrowed from the mission's stores. "I couldn't sleep," she said by way of explanation. "May I come in?" Roy stepped back, allowing her to enter. The small room seemed to shrink further with her presence, filling with a tension that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the unspoken current between them. "Sister Magdalena says we are welcome to stay as long as needed," Sarah told him, perching on the room's only chair. "She also mentioned that a trader who supplies the mission travels regularly between here and Tucson. He might be able to get a message to Edward without alerting James." Roy nodded, leaning against the wall. "That's good thinking, but you should consider what comes after. Even if we get evidence against Palmer, Tucson may never be safe for you again." "I know," Sarah acknowledged, her gaze steady. "I've been thinking about that. My parents are both gone, and I have only distant relatives back east whom I barely know. The West was to be my fresh start." A rueful smile touched her lips. "Just not the start I envisioned." "You could go to California," Roy suggested, "or north to Colorado, somewhere Palmer's reach doesn't extend." "And you?" she asked quietly. "What will you do once this is over?" The question caught him off guard. "Go back to the Circle M, I suppose, if they'll still have me after disappearing in the middle of a cattle drive." "A solitary life," Sarah observed, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away. "Is that truly what you want, Roy?" It was the first time she had used his given name, and something about the way it sounded in her voice made his heart constrict. "It's what I know," he answered honestly. Sarah rose from the chair and moved closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of darker blue in her eyes. "Today, you were willing to die for a woman you barely know. That doesn't strike me as the action of a man content with solitude." Roy found himself unable to retreat, pinned by her gaze as surely as if she had physically held him there. "It was the right thing to do," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "It was brave," Sarah countered, "and kind, and it makes me wonder what lies beneath that careful armor you wear." Before he could respond, she reached up and placed her palm against his cheek, her touch feather-light. "Thank you, Roy Kincaid, not just for saving my life but for reminding me that there are still good men in this world when I had reason to doubt." She rose on her tiptoes and pressed a soft kiss to his other cheek, then stepped back, a blush coloring her face. "I should go, good night." Long after she had left, Roy remained motionless, his hand unconsciously touching the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. The walls he had built so carefully over the years felt less solid somehow, as if her gentle touch had found cracks he hadn't known existed. For the first time in a very long time, Roy Kincaid slept without nightmares, his dreams instead filled with wheat gold hair and eyes the color of summer skies. The plan they formulated over the next 2 days was simple but fraught with risk. The mission's trader, a weathered Mexican man named Diego, would carry a message to Edward, the clerk, asking him to meet Sarah at the mission. If Edward was indeed as honorable as Sarah believed, he might help them find evidence of Palmer's crimes. And if he isn't, Roy questioned, still doubtful, if he's loyal to Palmer. Then we'll be no worse off than we are now, Sarah reasoned. The sisters have promised us sanctuary regardless. Diego departed for Tucson with their message, leaving them to wait in the peaceful confines of the mission. The forced inactivity chafed at Roy, who was accustomed to constant movement and work. He found himself helping with repairs around the mission grounds, grateful for the physical exertion that kept his thoughts from constantly returning to Sarah. She, meanwhile, had become a favorite among the children the sisters cared for, reading to them from the mission's small library and helping with their lessons. Watching her one afternoon, her face animated as she told a story to a circle of rapt children, Roy felt a warmth in his chest that both comforted and alarmed him. "She has a gift with the little ones," Sister Magdalena commented, following his gaze. The elderly nun's eyes were kind but perceptive. Such qualities make for a good mother. Roy shifted uncomfortably. "She's a fine woman. Deserves better than what happened to her." "Better, perhaps, than a man who would betray her," the sister agreed. "But not all men are so false. Some, I think, are true even when they believe themselves incapable of it." Before Roy could respond to this pointed observation, Sarah looked up and caught his eye. Her smile, spontaneous and bright, struck him like a physical blow. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that when this was over, returning to his solitary existence would be impossible. The realization was still settling over him when Diego returned 3 days later, bringing news that Edward had agreed to meet with Sarah. More surprising was his additional information. The banker's son had been bragging in Tucson's saloons about a lawyer who had paid handsomely for special work, mentioning Palmer by name. "The young man is not discreet when in his cups," Diego explained. "But it means others in Tucson are beginning to question Mr. Palmer's character." This was promising but still far from proof. They needed documents, records, something that would stand up in court, and for that, they needed Edward. The clerk arrived at the mission the following day, a nervous young man with spectacles and an earnest expression. His reunion with Sarah was emotional. He had believed her dead along with the other passengers. "When your letters stopped arriving, Mr. Palmer told everyone you had changed your mind about coming west," Edward explained as they sat in the mission's small garden. Then when news of the attack reached Tucson, he seemed genuinely shocked, even distraught. "I never suspected." "He's a lawyer," Roy pointed out. "Deception is part of his profession." Edward nodded reluctantly. "Still, it's difficult to believe he would go to such lengths. But after what Diego told me about the banker's son, I began to look more closely at the accounts." He pulled a leather portfolio from his satchel. "Mr. Palmer keeps separate ledgers for his personal expenditures. There are several large cash withdrawals in the weeks before the attack, with no explanation noted." "That's suggestive but not proof," Sarah said, disappointed. "No, but this might be." Edward extracted a folded paper from the portfolio. "I found this in a hidden compartment of his desk. It's a letter from someone named Jeb, requesting the final payment for a permanent solution to his problem. The handwriting matches notes I've seen from a man who occasionally does. Questionable work for Mr. Palmer." Roy took the letter, scanning its contents. The language was vague but damning when viewed in context. "This Jeb, he was the leader of the bandits," he told Sarah. "The one who escaped." "The letter alone might not be enough," Edward cautioned, "but combined with the ledger entries and testimony from the banker's son." He paused, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "There's something else, Mr. Palmer has been asking questions around town about a cowboy and a blonde woman. He's offering a substantial reward for information." Roy and Sarah exchanged concerned glances. "He knows I survived," she said softly. "And he's getting desperate," Roy added, "which makes him more dangerous but also more likely to make mistakes." Edward cleared his throat. "There's a U.S. Marshal arriving in Tucson tomorrow on his regular circuit. If you presented this evidence to him instead of the local law, who might be influenced by Mr. Palmer, we'd have a better chance at justice," Sarah finished, hope kindling in her eyes. Edward, you're brilliant. The young clerk blushed to the roots of his hair. I just want to see right done, Miss Everett. What Mr. Palmer attempted, it's unconscionable. Plans were made quickly after that. Edward would return to Tucson and continue his work as if nothing had changed, ensuring Palmer remained unaware of his involvement. Roy and Sarah would ride into town early the next morning to meet with the marshal before Palmer could intercept them. As Edward prepared to leave, he hesitated, looking at Sarah with obvious concern. Please be careful. Mr. Palmer is well connected and not above using those connections to protect himself. After he had gone, Roy found Sarah standing alone in the mission's small chapel, her expression thoughtful in the flickering candlelight. Having second thoughts? He asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. She shook her head. No, James must answer for what he's done. I'm just preparing myself for what comes after. And what is that? Roy's voice was gentle, encouraging rather than demanding. Sarah turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the candle flames. I don't know, everything I planned, everything I thought my life would be has changed. It's frightening and yet, she paused, a small smile touching her lips. Also strangely liberating. For the first time, my future is entirely my own to shape. That's no small thing, Roy acknowledged. Freedom to choose your own path. What about you? She asked, echoing her question from days earlier. Will you return to the Circle M when this is done? Roy had been pondering this very question during the long hours of work around the mission. His answer now came without hesitation. No, I've been writing for other men's brands too long. Thinking I might strike out on my own, find a piece of land, build something that's mine. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. That's a significant change from the solitary drifter I met by that campfire. I've had some cause to reconsider my outlook lately, Roy admitted, holding her gaze meaningfully. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Sarah took a small step closer, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent the sisters used in their washing. Roy, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, when we first met you told me that attachment is weakness. Do you still believe that? The question pierced straight to the heart of the transformation he had been undergoing since that fateful night. I believed it because it was safer than the alternative, he answered honestly. Safer to be alone than to risk losing someone else I cared for. And now, her eyes searched his, as if looking for something vital within his answer. Now I'm thinking that some risks might be worth taking. Roy's voice was low, rough with emotion he had denied for too long, that a life without connection isn't really living at all. Sarah's smile was like sunrise breaking over the desert. I believe that too. The moment hung between them, fragile and precious. Then Sister Magdalena's voice called from the doorway of the chapel, breaking the spell. Supper is ready, my children. And you will need your strength for tomorrow's journey. As they followed the elderly nun back to the refectory, Roy's hand brushed against Sarah's, and she twined her fingers with his for the briefest moment. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of promise. The ride into Tucson the next morning was tense with anticipation. They had departed the mission before dawn, hoping to reach town and locate the marshal before Palmer could be alerted to their presence. Roy had borrowed a second horse from the mission, allowing them to travel faster than they had on Rusty alone. Sarah rode beside him, her borrowed dress replaced by a simple skirt and blouse that would attract less attention. Her golden hair was tucked beneath a modest bonnet, though tendrils escaped to dance in the morning breeze. Despite the danger that awaited them, she rode with confidence, her back straight and her eyes clear with purpose. Remember, Roy cautioned as the first buildings of Tucson came into view, we go straight to the marshal's office. No detours, no stopping to speak with anyone. Sarah nodded. And if we're separated? The livery stable at the edge of town. Micah owes me a favor, he'll hide you if needed. They entered Tucson from the west, keeping to side streets and avoiding the main thoroughfare. The town was already awake and busy, merchants opening their shops, wagons delivering goods, and the usual assortment of cowboys, miners, and townspeople going about their business. Roy kept his hat pulled low, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. They were nearly to the courthouse where the marshal would be holding session when he spotted a familiar face, one of Palmer's hired guns from the Arroyo, standing on a corner and surveying the street with predatory attention. Don't look now, but we've got company, Roy murmured, guiding his horse closer to Sarah's, left side by the mercantile. Sarah maintained her composure admirably, keeping her gaze forward. He's seen us. Not yet. We'll cut through the alley ahead, might buy us a few minutes. They turned their horses into the narrow passage between buildings, emerging onto a parallel street that would still lead them to the courthouse. They had just rounded the corner when they found their path blocked by three men, James Palmer at their center. Palmer was exactly as Sarah had described him, tall, well-dressed, with the smooth good looks and confident bearing of a successful man. But there was a coldness in his eyes that betrayed the ruthlessness beneath the polished exterior. "Sarah, my dear," he greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "When I heard rumors of your survival, I could scarcely believe it." "What a miracle!" Sarah's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "Hello, James, I'd say it's good to see you, but we both know that would be a lie." Palmer's smile tightened. "I see your ordeal has affected your manners, no matter. You must be exhausted, poor thing. Allow me to escort you home where we can discuss everything privately." "She's not going anywhere with you," Roy stated flatly, his hand moving to rest near his revolver. Palmer's gaze shifted to him, dismissive yet calculating. "And you must be the cowboy who's been keeping my fiancée from her rightful place. I appreciate your assistance in her time of need, but your services are no longer required." "Your fiancée," Sarah's voice rose with indignation. "After sending men to murder me, you discuss me, James." A flash of anger crossed Palmer's face before he controlled it. "I don't know what wild stories you've invented to explain your absence, Sarah, but they won't be believed. Not against my word in this town." "Perhaps not," came a new voice from behind them, "but they might be believed against evidence." They all turned to see Edward standing there, the leather portfolio in his hands and a U.S. Marshal at his side. The marshal was an older man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be easily fooled. "Marshal Thompson," Palmer greeted him with forced cordiality, "this is a personal matter. My fiancée has been through a traumatic experience and is confused." "That's so," Thompson responded, his expression impassive, "because I've got a sworn statement here from Mr. Winters saying otherwise, along with some mighty interesting financial records." He nodded toward Edward. Palmer's confidence wavered visibly. "Edward, what is the meaning of this?" The clerk stepped forward, his nervousness evident but determination in his stance. "I couldn't stand by and allow you to harm Miss Everett, sir. It isn't right." "These wild accusations," Palmer began, but the marshal cut him off. "Save it for the judge, Palmer. I'm taking you in for questioning regarding the stagecoach attack." He turned to the men flanking Palmer. "Unless your friends want to join you, they'd best disperse." The men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly weighing their options. Palmer's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, panic replacing his earlier confidence. "This is absurd. I'm a respected attorney, you can't possibly believe." "We also have this," Sarah interrupted, producing the letter Edward had given them. "A request for payment from the very man who led the attack on my stagecoach." "In your handwriting, James." Palmer's face contorted with rage. With unexpected speed, he lunged toward Sarah, reaching for the letter. Roy moved instantly, stepping between them and delivering a powerful blow that sent Palmer staggering backward. The marshal drew his gun, pointing it at Palmer as the lawyer sprawled in the dust. "That'll be enough of that. You're under arrest, Palmer. We'll sort this all out proper like at the jail." As Palmer was led away, his veneer of respectability completely shattered, Sarah turned to Edward with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, your courage made this possible." The clerk adjusted his spectacles, embarrassed by her praise. "It was the right thing to do. Mr. Palmer betrayed not just you, but everything the law should stand for." In the days that followed, the full extent of Palmer's crimes came to light. Beyond the plot to murder Sarah, evidence emerged of embezzlement, land fraud, and collusion with various criminal elements throughout the territory. The case against him was overwhelming, ensuring he would face justice for his actions. Sarah gave her testimony to the court with dignity and composure, recounting the attack and her subsequent flight through the desert. Roy remained by her side throughout, his steady presence a comfort amidst the turmoil of legal proceedings. When it was over, when Palmer had been formally charged and remanded for trial, they stood together on the boardwalk outside the courthouse, the future stretching before them like the vast Arizona sky. "It's done," Sarah said softly, her relief evident in the relaxation of shoulders that had been tense for too long. "I can hardly believe it." "You were remarkable in there," Roy told her, admiration clear in his voice. "Most women, most people, would have broken under what you've endured." Sarah smiled up at him, the sunlight catching in her hair as she removed her bonnet. "I had help. I couldn't have survived without you, Roy." The busy street around them seemed to fade as their eyes held. In that moment, all the unspoken feelings that had grown between them in their shared ordeal demanded acknowledgement. "What will you do now?" Roy asked, the question carrying far more weight than its simple words suggested. Sarah considered before answering. "I still believe in fresh starts. The West still calls to me despite everything." She paused, gathering courage, "but I find I'm reluctant to face it alone again." Roy took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Sarah, I meant what I said about finding land, building something of my own. It's a hard life, full of uncertainty, but if you were willing to share it." "Are you asking me to join you?" she breathed, hope illuminating her features. "I'm asking for more than that," Roy said, his voice deep with emotion. "I'm asking you to build a life with me, to be my partner, my heart, my family." "Family," Sarah repeated, the word carrying all the yearning of someone who, like Roy, had known its loss too keenly. "Yes, Roy Kincaid, I would like that very much." He drew her closer then, heedless of the curious glances from passers-by, and kissed her with a tenderness that belied the strength in his arms. It was a promise, sealed in the bright Tucson sunlight, a promise of shared tomorrows and healing from yesterday's wounds. 6 months later, under a sky studded with stars, Roy stood on the porch of the small but sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands. The ranch wasn't much yet, just 100 acres, a modest herd and endless possibility, but it was theirs. Behind him, the door opened, spilling warm lamplight onto the wooden planks. Sarah joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the night chill. "Checking the stock again?" she asked, leaning into him as his arm circled her waist. "Just looking at the stars," he replied, "still can't quite believe all this is ours." Sarah followed his gaze upward, then back to the valley below where their small herd grazed peacefully. "It's a good start. Edward writes that 2 more families are considering settling in the valley come spring. We might have neighbors before long." Roy nodded, pleased at the prospect. The isolation that had once seemed necessary for survival now felt like a limitation to be overcome. Community, he was learning, brought its own kind of strength. "Any word from Sister Magdalena?" he asked. The elderly nun had been instrumental in their wedding at the mission 3 months earlier, a simple ceremony attended by Edward, Diego, and the mission's residents. "She sent her blessings and says the children miss my stories," Sarah replied with a smile. "I promised we'd visit when the weather turns cooler." They stood in companionable silence, the night wrapping around them like a familiar blanket. The desert stretched beyond their land, still wild and unforgiving in many ways, but no longer a symbol of necessary solitude. Roy turned to his wife, still marveling at how completely she had transformed his life. The walls he had built around his heart hadn't just crumbled, they had been rebuilt into something stronger, a foundation for a future he hadn't dared imagine. "I love you," he said simply, the words still new enough to carry weight yet comfortable enough to come naturally. Sarah's smile was radiant in the moonlight. "And I love you, Roy Kincaid." He pulled her close then, their silhouettes merging into one against the luminous desert night. "You'll be my family," said the cowboy as he pulled her close in the moonlit desert, his voice a whispered promise. "Now and always." Sarah's arms tightened around him, her answer not in words but in the certainty of her embrace. 2 souls who had found in each other the belonging they had both sought, proof that even in the harshest landscapes, love could not only survive but flourish. And as the moon tracked its path across the star-scattered sky, it illuminated not just a cabin and a fledgling ranch, but a home in the truest sense. A place where past wounds were healing and future dreams were taking root, nurtured by the love of 2 people who had discovered that the greatest frontier of all was the journey of 2 hearts finding their way to each other.